Gene Hackman died on February 18th, 2025, and the news didn't just end a life. It detonated a question Hollywood wasn't ready to face. For hours after the confirmation, grief spread fast. But then something else surfaced. A sentence. A resurfaced statement. Words Gene Hackman had spoken quietly before the world said goodbye. Almost immediately, those words were labeled his final message. And once people read them, everything changed. Because the message didn't sound like a farewell. It sounded like a warning. It sounded like a man who knew exactly how his life would be misunderstood once he was gone. Fans were stunned, critics were divided, and the internet did what it always does. Turn speculation into certainty. Was he saying goodbye? Was he confessing something? Or was this message never meant for us at all? This documentary reveals what really happened in Gene Hackman's final chapter, what he said before death, and why those words hit harder after February 18th, 2025. Watch until the end, because once you understand the truth behind his final message, you'll never look at his legacy the same way again. February 18th, 2025, when the news broke. The confirmation landed like a punch. Early reports stated that Gene Hackman had died at the age of 95. Within minutes, headlines exploded across news outlets and social media. For a man who had disappeared from Hollywood decades earlier, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Tributes poured in from actors who had worked with him, directors who feared him on set, and fans who grew up watching his toughest, darkest performances. What made the news even more unsettling was the setting. Hackman had lived privately for years, far from Hollywood, far from cameras, far from interviews. There were no recent public appearances to prepare people for the end. One day, he was simply a legend in retirement. The next, he was gone. As details slowly emerged, the tone shifted from mourning to shock. People weren't just asking how he died. They were asking what he left behind. Because within hours of the announcement, a quote began circulating, something Hackman had said not long before his death. And suddenly, the story was no longer just about loss. It was about meaning. The so-called final message didn't come from a dramatic deathbed confession. There was no recorded goodbye, no letter released to the public. Instead, it was a line from a late-life statement, spoken quietly, almost casually. But after his death, those words were ripped from their moment and dropped into a new reality. People read them differently now. What once sounded reflective suddenly felt final. What once sounded personal now felt public. Viewers claimed he was talking about regret. Others believed he was distancing himself from fame on purpose, knowing how cruel remembrance could be. Some even said the message proved he had already made peace with dying. The truth is more complicated and more disturbing. Gene Hackman never shaped his words for the internet. He never prepared a farewell for fans. And yet, after February 18th, 2025, his private thoughts became a global obsession. The message spread faster than context, faster than facts, faster than grief could settle. And this was only the beginning. Because once those words were labeled his final message, everything about Gene Hackman's final years was suddenly re-examined. His silence, his retreat, and the life he chose to live when no one was watching. For years before his death, Gene Hackman lived almost like a ghost to the public. No premieres, no interviews, no appearances that could reassure fans or prepare them for what was coming. To the outside world, he had simply vanished. But behind closed doors, his final years were marked by quiet routine, isolation, and a body that was slowly giving up. Those close to him described a man who had already stepped away from everything that once defined him. Hollywood wasn't missed. Fame wasn't mourned. Hackman had made his decision long before the world noticed. He was done being watched. As his health declined, his circle became smaller. Days blended together. The man who once dominated screens with force and authority now lived far from attention, choosing privacy over legacy management. This silence is what made the final message feel so haunting. Because when someone disappears for that long, every word they ever said starts to feel like a clue. Fans didn't know how he was living, so they assumed the worst. And when death finally came, people retroactively searched for signs, convinced the ending had been written years earlier. By the time February 18th, 2025 arrived, Gene Hackman's world had narrowed to the essentials. There were no public schedules, no assistants, no press statements. What happened in those final days was quiet, controlled, and deeply private, exactly how he had lived for years. When authorities confirmed his death, the lack of immediate detail only intensified speculation. People wanted timelines. They wanted explanations. They wanted something dramatic to match the legend. Instead, what they got was silence. And silence invites imagination. Online, theories began forming instantly. Some claimed he had been suffering for years. Others believed he had intentionally withdrawn, knowing the end was near. The truth, however, was far less cinematic. There was no performance, no stage farewell, just a man reaching the natural end of a long life, away from the noise he once commanded. Yet the public didn't accept that easily, because a simple ending felt wrong for someone so powerful. So the story kept growing, fueled by uncertainty and the emotional weight of unfinished business. When official information finally emerged, it grounded the story in reality, but not without controversy. Gene Hackman died from natural causes related to age and long-term health complications. No foul play, no hidden conspiracy, no dramatic twist. And still, people were shocked. The shock didn't come from how he died. It came from how ordinary it was. After decades of intense performances, violent roles, and commanding screen presence, his ending felt too quiet, too normal. For some fans, that simplicity was unsettling. They expected tragedy. Instead, they got inevitability. And that's where the final message took on even more power. Once people accepted the cause of death, they turned back to his words, searching for deeper meaning. If the body gave no answers, maybe the message would. Maybe that sentence, spoken long before, was his way of closing the door on a life the public never truly knew. By now, Gene Hackman was no longer just a man who had died. He had become a puzzle, and the world was determined to solve him, whether he wanted that or not. Long before the headlines announced his death, Gene Hackman was already fighting a battle the public knew nothing about. He never turned his health into a story. He never used illness for sympathy. Instead, he did what he had always done. He disappeared. As the years passed, people assumed he was simply enjoying retirement. Few realized how much his physical and mental strength had changed. There were no interviews explaining his condition, no statements asking for understanding. Hackman chose silence, even when that silence created distance between him and the world that once adored him. Friends noticed the change. His energy faded. Conversations became shorter. The man known for control began losing it in ways he could not stop. This hidden struggle explains why his final words felt heavier after his death. Once people learned he had been quietly declining, they reread everything he'd said near the end of his life. What once sounded casual now sounded deliberate. What once felt detached now felt like preparation. And suddenly, the message wasn't just reflective. It felt personal in a way that unsettled everyone. This is where the story truly darkens. After his death, fans and commentators began asking the same question over and over again. Did Gene Hackman know his time was almost over? The question wasn't driven by medical reports. It was driven by his words. The tone, the timing, the way he spoke about stepping away, about being finished, about having nothing left to prove. There was no dramatic declaration, no emotional confession, but there was a calm finality in how he spoke during his last known public statements. He talked like a man who had already closed every chapter. No nostalgia, no longing, just acceptance. And after February 18th, 2025, that acceptance felt chilling. Some believe he sensed the decline and chose to retreat fully, knowing the end wouldn't be far. Others argue he was simply tired of the world, tired of being analyzed, tired of being owned by his past work. Either way, once death confirmed the timeline, people couldn't stop connecting the dots, even if some of those dots never existed. Before his death, the message barely registered. After his death, it became unavoidable. One sentence was enough to reshape how people saw his final years. It changed how fans interpreted his silence. It changed how critics framed his retirement. It even changed how his films were discussed, as if every performance had been leading toward that one quiet ending. The message didn't change the facts of his life. It changed the emotion attached to them. It turned privacy into mystery, silence into meaning, absence into intention. Suddenly, Gene Hackman wasn't just a retired actor who lived quietly and died peacefully. He became a man who, according to the public, had left behind a coded goodbye. And that is what truly changed everything. Not the cause of death, not the date, but the way one misunderstood message gave people permission to rewrite his story. Whether he wanted that or not, his final words, real or imagined, became the lens through which his entire legacy was re-examined. From this point on, Gene Hackman was no longer just remembered. He was interpreted. After February 18th, 2025, Many people expected an immediate, detailed statement from Gene Hackman's family. They wanted clarification. They wanted emotion. They wanted answers that could quiet the noise. But what followed instead was silence. And that silence became gasoline. No extended interviews. No public explanations about his final days. No commentary on the so-called final message that was now circulating everywhere. For some, this restraint felt respectful. For others, it felt suspicious. And in the absence of explanation, the internet filled the gap on its own. Speculation began to harden into belief. People assumed the family was protecting something. Others claimed the silence proved the message was real and intentional. In reality, the family's choice reflected the same pattern Hackman had followed for decades: privacy above all else. But the modern audience no longer knows how to sit with silence. When answers don't arrive, stories take their place. And by staying quiet, the family unintentionally allowed the myth to grow larger than the truth. What began as mourning slowly transformed into analysis. Fans didn't just grieve Gene Hackman, they investigated him. Old interviews resurfaced. Forgotten quotes were reposted. Clips were edited, slowed down, set to music, and framed as if they were clues left behind on purpose. Grief demanded closure, and when none was offered officially, obsession stepped in. People wanted his death to say something. They wanted it to confirm a theory, validate a feeling, or deliver a final lesson. The final message became the centerpiece of that need. It gave people something to hold onto, something to decode. But in doing so, the man himself started to disappear beneath the interpretation. Gene Hackman, the person, was replaced by Gene Hackman, the symbol. And the louder the speculation became, the further the truth drifted away. By this point, the story was no longer just about a death. It was about how the world refuses to let legends leave quietly, and how one sentence was enough to keep him trapped in conversation long after he was gone. Once the initial shock faded, the media stepped in to give the story a shape. Headlines no longer focused only on the death itself. They focused on interpretation. Articles began connecting his retirement, his silence, and that resurfaced message into a single narrative, as if it had all been planned. Phrases like "he knew," "he sensed the end," and "his final words now make sense" appeared everywhere. Very few outlets stopped to question whether that framing was fair. Context was trimmed down to make room for emotion. Nuance was sacrificed for clicks. The message was no longer something he once said. It became something he meant for us to hear at the end. And once the media agreed on that angle, it became almost impossible to undo. This is how legacies quietly shift. Not through lies, but through emphasis. By choosing which details to repeat and which to ignore, the media transformed a private man's quiet ending into a public statement he never officially made. Almost overnight, Gene Hackman's films were no longer just performances. They were treated as reflections, final statements, accidental goodbyes. Viewers rewatched his toughest roles and searched for clues, anger, exhaustion, regret, that now felt prophetic. Lines of dialogue were quoted as if he had written them himself. Roles that once showcased power were now framed as warnings. Characters who walked away were suddenly seen as mirrors of his own retreat from Hollywood. The audience wasn't just watching movies anymore. They were rewriting meaning onto them. This shift changed how his career was discussed. Instead of celebrating range and discipline, conversations focused on endings. His body of work was treated like a long road leading toward one quiet exit. And whether intentional or not, that framing locked his legacy into a single emotional direction. The most unsettling part of all this wasn't what Gene Hackman said. It was what he didn't say. His refusal to explain himself, even in death, became symbolic. People interpreted his silence as defiance, wisdom, or hidden pain. Everyone projected something different onto it. In reality, the silence was consistent. He had lived that way for decades. But after death, consistency is rarely respected. Silence becomes a blank screen, and the public fills it with whatever story they need most. By this point, the final message had fully eclipsed the man. It no longer mattered what he intended. The world had already decided what his ending meant. And once that happens, the truth struggles to compete. Gene Hackman didn't announce his goodbye, but the world wrote one for him anyway. By the time the dust began to settle, the so-called final message had already hardened into myth. People spoke about it as if it were a deliberate farewell, carefully chosen and timed. Online discussions treated it like a confession, a warning, even a coded explanation for why Gene Hackman walked away from the world the way he did. But when the emotion is stripped away, the reality looks very different. The message was never delivered as a goodbye. It wasn't framed as last words. It wasn't released by his family or intended for public consumption at the end of his life. It was a thought spoken earlier during a period when he was already living privately and thinking about aging, purpose, and withdrawal. The problem wasn't what he said, it was when the world decided to listen. After his death, people needed something to anchor their grief. A sentence became that anchor. It offered clarity where there was none, intention where there may have been only reflection. The myth grew because it felt satisfying. It gave death a narrative arc. But in doing so, it erased the possibility that his ending was exactly what it looked like: quiet, unannounced, and unperformed. To understand why the message was misunderstood, you have to understand how fiercely Gene Hackman protected his private life. Long before illness, long before age slowed him down, he had already decided that public access to him was over. He didn't want to be explained. He didn't want to be interpreted. He wanted to live without commentary. In his final years, that decision became even more important. His world shrank by choice, not tragedy. He lived away from Hollywood, away from attention, surrounded by routine rather than recognition. There were no final interviews planned, no legacy documentaries approved, no attempt to shape how history would remember him. This is why the idea of a calculated final message doesn't fit who he was. He didn't curate endings. He avoided them. He didn't prepare audiences for closure because he never believed they were owed one. And when death finally came, it followed the same rules he had lived by for decades. Minimal explanation, maximum distance. The public mistook that distance for mystery, but it was consistency. And that consistency makes the myth of an intentional final message far less convincing. In the weeks leading up to February 18th, 2025, there was no dramatic buildup, no public alarm, no warning signs broadcast to the world. Life continued quietly. Those closest to him noticed decline, but not spectacle. There was no announcement that the end was near because that was never how he lived. When death arrived, it did so without performance. Authorities confirmed the date. Details emerged slowly. And with each confirmed fact, one thing became clear. The timeline did not support the dramatic interpretations people wanted to believe. There was no sudden revelation, no final declaration, no orchestrated moment meant to be remembered forever. Yet by the time the facts were clear, the story had already been written by the public. The message had been elevated. The silence had been romanticized. The ending had been reshaped into something more meaningful than it ever needed to be. The truth is harder to accept because it's simpler. Gene Hackman didn't leave the world with a grand final statement. He left it the same way he had lived for years, quietly, deliberately, and without explanation. And that truth, once understood, changes everything people thought they knew about his final message. After February 18th, 2025, Gene Hackman's legacy quietly shifted. Not because of a new film, not because of a revelation from his past, but because of how people felt about his ending. Before his death, he was remembered as a disciplined, intimidating, uncompromising actor who walked away on his own terms. After his death, he was framed as a man who left behind a final thought meant to be decoded. This reframing altered conversations about his career. Critics began discussing his retirement as if it were symbolic rather than personal. Fans treated his silence as intentional messaging rather than preference. His body of work was revisited not to celebrate craft, but to search for meaning connected to his final years. Scenes were reinterpreted. Dialogue was repurposed. Characters were linked to his real life in ways he never encouraged. Legacy, in this case, wasn't rewritten by facts. It was rewritten by emotion. And once emotion takes control, it rarely asks permission from truth. Hackman became less of a man and more of an idea. A symbol of withdrawal. A symbol of quiet resistance. A symbol of saying goodbye without saying goodbye. Whether he wanted that or not, death gave the public ownership of his story. And the final message, real or exaggerated, became the key they used to unlock it. As weeks passed and emotions cooled, one uncomfortable reality became impossible to ignore. There was no hidden meaning waiting to be discovered. No secret farewell. No carefully planned last words. The story people wanted simply didn't exist. But by then, the truth no longer mattered as much as the version people had already accepted. Corrections were quiet. Clarifications went unnoticed. The dramatic narrative had already done its work. Videos remained online. Headlines stayed searchable. The myth lived on because it was more satisfying than reality. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, the moment when truth loses momentum. The internet doesn't reward restraint. It doesn't amplify simplicity. It chooses the version of events that feels the most complete, even when it's built on assumption. Gene Hackman didn't need a final message to complete his life, but the world needed one to complete its story about him. And that need says more about modern audiences than it ever did about the man himself. In the end, the most shocking truth is also the quietest one. Gene Hackman didn't leave behind a message to explain himself. He didn't try to control how he would be remembered. He didn't offer closure. And that absence is exactly what unsettled people the most. The message that changed everything wasn't a sentence he spoke. It was the realization that some lives don't end with explanations. Some legends refuse to perform even in death. Hackman lived privately, retreated deliberately, and died without spectacle, and the world struggled to accept that. His final chapter wasn't about mystery. It was about boundaries. And the discomfort audiences felt after his death came from realizing they were never meant to cross them. That is the real ending. Not dramatic, not poetic, but honest. And once you understand that, everything people claimed about his final message falls apart. Leaving behind the man he always was, uncompromising, silent, and completely uninterested in giving the world the ending it demanded.